This is America's Roundtable from Washington, D.C., a weekly radio program with leading thinkers and compelling voices representing the media, business, think tanks, and the political arena. I'm Joel Anand-Samy, your co-host, joined by Natasha Sardorci, economist, co-founder of the International Leaders Summit. During this segment, we'll be joined by two guests to explain a most recent study on illicit financial flows from developing countries. Dr. Dev Kar is the lead economist at Global Financial Integrity. Prior to joining the GFI, Dev was a senior economist at the International Monetary Fund in Washington, D.C. During a career spanning nearly 32 years at the IMF, Dev worked on a wide variety of macroeconomic and statistical issues, both at IMF headquarters and on different types of IMF missions to member countries. Clark Gascoigne is the communications director at Global Financial Integrity. He previously served as a director of new media for both GFI and the Task Force on Financial Integrity and Economic Development. Gentlemen, we welcome you to America's Roundtable.
Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you. Thank you.
6 years ago, when Global Financial Integrity was formed, the term illicit financial flows was non-existent or insignificant in the global political economy lexicon. Today, this term and its surrounding concepts are used and addressed by the G20, UN, World Bank, IMF, OECD, European Union, and national governments across the planet. A UN official recently commented that GFI's job is to unpack the opaque. In your report, you state the developing world lost $859 billion in illicit outflows in 2010, an increase of 11% over 2009. The capital outflows stem from crime, corruption, tax evasion, and other illicit activity. The report finds that illicit financial outflows from 2001 to 2010, developing countries lost $5.86 trillion to illicit outflows. Could you share with our listeners on America's Roundtable some of the important findings in your compelling research endeavor and perhaps the trends you noticed when looking at your previous studies?
Yes, I'll be happy to. The first point I would like to make is the reason why the terminology illicit financial flows have taken off rather than capital flight is because illicit financial flows connotes the money leaving the country as well as absorption of that illicit funds somewhere else. So a flow is a outflow from a source country and its absorption in a destination country. So it gives the impression of a two-way flow, whereas capital flight sort of looks upon the problem as a problem of developing countries, and that does not involve the developed countries. So this two-way flow is very important to foster greater cooperation between developing and developed countries. So that's one thing that I want to get it right out of the way. The second general point I'd like to make is illicit flows, the models that we use in here at GFI, are not able to capture a significant part of illicit flows that arise from illegal activities like drug trafficking, sex trade, human trafficking, and other like trade in contraband goods, smuggling, which are mainly settled in cash. So this is a limitation of economic models. It has nothing to do with GFI as such, but economic models are not able to capture transactions that are settled in cash. So if anything, our estimates understate the problem of illicit flows. The other important aspect of our work is that we look at all developing countries without regard to the political systems. We are completely apolitical. We are independent. We do an analysis that is we apply across the board to all developing countries, and then we rank these developing countries according to the size of the volume of illicit outflows coming out from them. And we find that in the top 10 countries, China leading the pack. The exact rankings are given in our report. The top 10 countries also includes India, it includes Indonesia, China is number 1, Mexico in fact is number 2, Malaysia is number 3, Saudi Arabia, Russia, Philippines, Nigeria, India, Indonesia, and the UAE. Those are among the top 10 countries. Now, the surprising thing here is that compared to the list that in the previous last year's IFF update, the thing here is the important point here is that the new rankings basically leave many of them intact because the rankings there doesn't change as far as China is concerned, Mexico is concerned, Saudi Arabia, Russia, they all stay. But the new countries that are listed here are Philippines, Nigeria, India, Indonesia. They displace countries like Kuwait and Qatar. The reason they displace it is our new study, the 2011 study, focuses very sharply on illicit flows that are likely to be illicit rather than a mix of licit and illicit flows. So when you look at just illicit flows, some of these countries come to the fore and others are displaced. What is striking about the new rankings is that illicit flows impact more people around the world than previously thought. I mean, for instance, the population of India is huge. It's the second most populated country in the world. So if it displaces a country like Kuwait, it means that more people are affected by illicit flows adversely than what the previous methodology implied. In other words, when there's an illicit outflow from a country, it robs the country of the opportunity to sort of lift its people from poverty. It robs those countries of efforts to raise revenues and to expand their budgets, to roll out social safety nets and other programs like immunization, improve their nutrition, etc. So these are the main findings of the report, and let me know if I can elaborate on it any further.
Right. Dr. Carr, how would you explain to a citizen on the street, how does illicit outflow take place? Could you provide some examples for our listeners?
Yes, of course. Now, illicit outflows take place from two main channels. One is through the balance of payments or external accounts of a country, as for example, when a bank transfers illicit funds through electronic means which are not reported to the central bank. Usually, bank transactions are reported to the central bank, but often in weak countries, in countries where governance is weak, some of the banks are outside the net of the central bank and the reporting requirements are weak. So the banks do engage in transactions which are sort of under the radar. So a electronic transfer of funds from one of these unregistered or unknown banks to a bank abroad, to an account abroad, would be one example of illicit flows. Another example of illicit flows is through the misinvoicing of trade, which is very dominant in many countries, or many developing countries. For example, export under-invoicing and import over-invoicing are two important channels through which money can be sent out. To give you an example, suppose there is an export of tea from India, and the Indian exporter declares the tea consignment at $10 million, whereas in fact that consignment is worth $15 million. He asked the U.S. importer of that tea to deposit the $5 million that it owes him in a offshore center. So instead of the U.S. importer is declaring $15 million to the U.S. authorities, but the Indian exporter is declaring $10 million to the Indian authorities, Indian customs. But the whole fact is that the U.S. customs is not talking to the Indian customs on these hundreds of transactions that goes on throughout the month. So there is no capability for that. So there is this collusion between traders which facilitates an outflow of capital, and which is entirely illicit because this kind of deliberate misinvoicing is not permitted by any country. So if it is against the law, it's illicit. So this is one way. On the import side, say an Indian importer of tractors from the U.S. overinflates the import price. He overpays the exporter, U.S. exporter. Say the consignment is worth, he declares it to be $20 million, but actually it is worth $15 million. He pays $20 million to the U.S. exporter and says the extra $5 million that I paid you, please deposit in my account in an offshore center. So this is a vehicle, a channel through which illicit funds move back and forth between countries.
Dr. Carr, did you perhaps also make a list of the recipient countries? So what are the countries that receive the largest amounts of illicit outflows?
When I first joined GFI more than 5 years ago, that question was put to me, and of course this is a very difficult question. I mean, economists have not studied this question in any depth because data are not available. I mean, the countries that are receiving, that is what is called absorption. Like there is two sides of the same coin. If there's an outflow, there's an absorption. That, in other words, it's being deposited somewhere, but the data on deposit statistics is almost non-existent. First of all, the tax havens don't cooperate. They don't publish any reports that shows this is the amount of money that we have deposited in our accounts. Forget about individual accounts. Of course, they are not going to be publishing that, but they don't even give aggregate data. Even a country like Switzerland, which is listed as a tax haven, but is also an industrial country, do not publish any data on aggregate deposits. There's opacity all around on the part of deposit takers, and there are also opacity with regard to the financial instruments. For example, there are various instruments which does not have to have any information on beneficial ownership. Who is the ultimate beneficial? Who is the ultimate owner of these assets? The global financial system is set up in such a way that all this information can remain hidden. The question, it's a simple question, where does all these illicit flows end up? But it's very difficult to carry out the exercise. We did do a study which shows that, up to 44% of the flows end up in tax havens and the rest end up in banks. So banks play a major role in the absorption of illicit flows.
Yes, I'm glad you mentioned Switzerland. Actually, in 2008, the bipartisan U.S. Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations exposed the LGT Group as, I quote, a leading Liechtenstein financial institution that is owned by and financially benefits the Liechtenstein royal family, end of quote, accusing them of advising U.S. clients to open accounts in the name of Liechtenstein foundations to hide their beneficial ownership of the account assets, advising clients on the use of complex offshore structures to hide ownership of assets outside of Liechtenstein, and establishing so-called transfer corporations to disguise asset transfers to and from LGT accounts. And then the U.S. Senate report stated, I quote, LGT private bankers, including Prince Philip of Liechtenstein, met with a U.S. citizen and his father to pitch the transfer of $30 million from Bank of Bermuda to LGT. According to the same report, LGT clients were enabled to use the bank services to evade U.S. taxes, dodge creditors, and ignore even court orders. And there has been the same pattern that we observed with another bank owned by, again, Liechtenstein royal family, involving the countries in Southeast Europe. Many times we are dealing with mafia states, and authorities of those countries are not interested in exposing their nationals who are at the highest political levels and retrieving funds. How can the people of developing nations go about retrieving the illicit enrichment of their corrupt politicians and their private partners in crime?
Well, that is a good question. I mean, of course, I would like to make a couple of points here. Number one, we here in GFI don't look at individuals, or we don't look at individual institutions, because we are not we don't have the capacity to do that. That is the work of investigative agencies. Our work is on the macro level, dealing with country data. So we are always coming up with aggregate numbers and not specific numbers. That's one point. Second point is that the question that you raised, how can people of developing countries curtail illicit flows? There is a range of factors. I mean, one thing you can consider is that the World Bank comes up with governance indicators. There are 6 aspects of governance which gives a clue as to what they can do. One is voice and accountability. I mean, that the people have to have more voice. The people who are, all the economic agents must be held to accountable standards. Second, there has to be rule of law. In other words, law has to hold. If, for example, cases are not settled, or if there is a long delay in settlement of cases, then that doesn't work. Then government effectiveness, how effective the government is in providing services, and if the government services are corrupt or not. There is the control of corruption. How good is the control of corruption? So there are 6 aspects like that. Action needs to be taken in all these aspects. It's a very slow process. You're not going to get huge changes overnight. Our prescriptions, basically, we deal with the control of corruption in GFI. We don't get involved so much in the other aspects. Our expertise are on corruption. And there, if there is, for example, trade mispricing, then we say, well, the customs institutions need to be strengthened. Now, that is part of the regulatory environment which the World Bank indicators point out, and that is also touches on rule of law, and it also touches on strength of institutions, and it also touches on government effectiveness. So all of these things are linked. So when we look at, say, for example, customs reform to strengthen customs, it touches on these different aspects of governance. We suggest, the automatic exchange of information, tax information between countries, so that, tax evaders are, it becomes very difficult, more difficult to evade taxes. We ask countries to strengthen their anti-money laundering laws so that activity becomes more difficult. We try to ensure that, authorities understand the meaning of beneficial ownership and then push for greater accountability by institutions on that score. In other words, ask the banks and the financial institutions to compile more information, collect more information on beneficial ownership of accounts. So there are concrete ways that citizens can get involved. Civic society also has a role to play. Governments have a role to play in that. Developing country governments can take a stand in the G20, where they can, push for greater transparency and accountability in the global financial system. In other words, have the industrial countries work with them to make it more difficult for tax havens to be so opaque and non-accountable. So there is a whole range of both domestic and international actions that can be taken, but none of it is, happens overnight. It's something that happens progressively, but should happen in a consistent manner across different countries. But we haven't seen that happening in many countries. In some countries, there is a move, there is a greater awareness. But first of all, we are also involved in raising public awareness so that civic society and the public also demands greater action from their governments.
Dr. Carr, I believe that this is a very important study in helping all of us citizens and individuals in the legislative arena, and those that are involved in justice agencies as well, to get a better picture of the significance of this problem. And I think it's best placed in your report when it states that the developing world lost $859 billion in illicit outflows in 2010 alone.
Yes, it is a very important issue, because those who are residents of advanced countries can think that, this is a problem of developing countries and it doesn't impact us. But it does, because in the sense that if developing countries are losing this kind of capital, and it is the industrial countries that is giving aid to the developing countries, it's the taxpayers that are financing that aid. And if that aid is not being utilized properly, and the capital is leaving the back door on that scale, on the ratio is like 1 to 10, then of course it's a waste of taxpayers' money.
Exactly.
So that is how the residents of industrial countries, advanced countries like the United States, are impacted by this problem.
Indeed.
There should be, I would say, more stricter mechanisms that would be introduced by IMF, by the World Bank, by other organizations that are donor organizations providing aid or some kind of other technical assistance, by requiring those countries to be more transparent or to even accept foreign judges or visiting judges and prosecutors in order to deal with these problems.
Well, that point is well taken, but you see there is a problem here. The problem is that when the Bretton Woods institutions like the IMF and the World Bank were established after the Second World War, the emphasis was on reconstruction and on economic stabilization. As the official name of the World Bank is called International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. So the world was ravaged by this war on an unprecedented scale, and the industrial countries was focused on stabilizing the macroeconomic stabilization, which was given to the IMF, and long-term economic development, which was handed over to the World Bank. So that was the main objective of these two institutions, and governance was not an objective. You see, you will not find governance to be an issue in the IMF Articles of Agreement. So if it is not in the agenda, these institutions cannot discuss this. So when the missions go to these countries, it is only discussed in a sort of a very tangential way, or in a way that only impinges upon a country's capacity to repay these institutions. For example, in the IMF, if a country comes and borrows from the IMF, the fund has to be convinced, or the countries have to sort of say that yes, I mean, corruption is a serious issue here, so much so that we are not able to pay back. I mean, so under those limiting conditions, the fund can get involved in governance issues, but not on a general matter. So much so that the recent, this euro crisis, that hit Greece and other southern European countries, the IMF missed that signal. The IMF missed the signal because the IMF was always looking at the official economy,
right,
the above ground economy. The reason it missed the signal is because of the huge gap in the monitoring of the underground economy.
But as you mentioned, that the funds are leaving the countries through the back door, and it's taxpayers that are footing the bill in the end. So there should be more engagement from, putting some mechanisms in place in order to safeguard taxpayers' money in the end.
Right. But the flows that are the external aid that is being given there are two types of aid: multilateral aid and bilateral aid. So if the multilateral aid, I mean, the multilateral institutions are responsible only for the multilateral aid. But multilateral institutions cannot extend their authority over bilateral aid. For example, U.S. is giving bilateral aid to Afghanistan, and it's a huge budget. Afghanistan, there's a lot of corruption there.
Right.
So it's impacting the U.S. government directly. The IMF has no say in that.
Indeed.
The IMF has no jurisdiction over loans that are extended by the United States to Afghanistan or to Iraq. So that is the problem. That is, you have to be a gatekeeper of those resources in order to have a say about those resources.
And that is exactly right in what you were stating in some of the mechanisms that could be, or some of the specific items that could be stressed, is the importance or the significance of the rule of law, having independent judiciary,
right.
Making sure that there's greater transparency, and making sure that a civic society and civil society is engaged in the process to basically address the issue of accountability and transparency of their politicians. But I think studies like yours do make a significant difference in the discussion and the debate of the significance of illicit financial outflows, and what can we do as a society to start addressing these issues, because at the same time, the West is always encouraged to give more aid and assistance to developing countries, and at the same time, the measures are not put in place to be able to safeguard the taxpayer money, both from, say, Western donors or benevolent countries, and those that are the recipient countries then.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, in fact, we have, in the short 5 years that we have been in existence, we have come a long way. Our work has been disseminated all over the world, and it is being noticed by academia, by government ministries, central banks. We have, our work is now recognized as the leading kind of work in this area, leading research in this area. And we have made a difference. There's no doubt about that. But much needs to be done. Because ultimately, it's the countries that have to take action on all these fronts.
We commend you for your work. It's a great diagnosis, and we just noticed also from your report that has been just published in Southeast Europe, it has stirred the waters significantly.
Thank you very much. That's nice to know.
Terrific indeed. Clark Gascoigne is the Communications Director at Global Financial Integrity. He previously served as the Director of New Media for both GFI and the Task Force on Financial Integrity and Economic Development.
Thanks for having us.
And Clark, could you be able to briefly describe how this study is impacting countries around the world and their response to this important study?
The study really helps to raise awareness about the problem, and the great thing about it is it does have data on about 150 different developing countries, and the costs that crime, corruption, tax evasion have on each and every one of them, which can be used by policymakers just to highlight the sort of problems and the economic costs this has on their countries. We don't have specifics on what companies or what individuals are doing criminally to move the money out, but it's a benchmark and highlights just how significant this problem is.
In fact, when looking at the list of these nations, we find nations belonging to Euro-Atlantic institutions listed with significant illicit outflows.
Absolutely.
Would your study then raise concerns about the effectiveness of anti-corruption laws in nations who have recently joined the European Union and NATO? And what could be done to address some of these systemic problems?
Well, there's a bunch of things that can be done, and this is not just a problem for countries that have recently joined NATO or recently joined the European Union. It's a problem for pretty much every country in the world to a certain extent, some more than others. I mean, the problem is that not only is there an outflow of money from these countries, there is also an absorption, as Dr. Carr was mentioning. There are countries out there that are willing to take this money and are facilitating the outflow of this money. The United States is one of those countries. Other, tax havens, other developed countries like the UK have anonymous shell corporation and other structures that make it very easy to move your money opaquely without anybody knowing about it, law enforcement knowing about it, out of developing countries and into offshore bank accounts where you can do whatever with it. It's not just a problem for developing countries. I mean, our report looks at developing countries, but the same problems, the same methods used to move money out of developing countries are used to move money out of developed countries as well and to evade taxes in developed countries. We looked recently at Greece, an interview that our director did with Der Spiegel, and we did some research and we found that about $260 billion illicitly fled Greece in the lead up to the debt crisis between 2003 and 2009. The past 2 years, there's been an illicit inflow of money since the debt crisis struck, which is interesting, but the same structures are moving money out of developed countries as well.
In fact, Clark, as you've just stated that specific figure for Greece, it is also interesting for our listeners to note that the package and the aid that has been set aside for Greece totals above 240 billion euros. So it's interesting to note how some $270 billion have left Greece up to the run-up to the crisis and how much the European Union's member state taxpayers have had to fork to be able to save Greece from its crisis. And a few months ago, we were privileged to have Dr. Daniel Kaufman from the Brookings Institution, and he was quoted specifically in regard to Greece. When the quote was in the Wall Street Journal, and Marcus Walker stated, he found that bribery, patronage, and other public corruption are major contributors to the country's ballooning debt, depriving the Greek state each year of the equivalent of at least 8% of its gross domestic product, or more than $20 billion, or actually 20 billion euros, about $27 billion. And then when we look at the Greek crisis and the challenges faced by developing nations, what would you suggest as, say, principal solutions in addressing the hemorrhaging of nations and to be able to somewhat work toward retrieving these stolen public funds?
Further on Greece, Greece has the largest, out of all OECD countries, they have the largest underground economy next to Mexico. 30% of their GDP is underground economy, and that's criminal organizations, corrupt payments, smugglers, tax evading type people, and that's all fueled by these illicit outflows. That is what places like the IMF and World Bank and others weren't able to look at in the lead up to the debt crisis. Now, things that could be done to address this, there are certain things, there's a lot that can be done by developing countries themselves, such as working to reform their own customs units, their customs departments, to look more closely for trade mispricing tactics. There's software out there that can be used to determine whether or not payments or invoices are invoiced properly at the normal market value of what those invoices should be, whether they're significantly fluctuating away from that, to help detect that. Other recommendations we have are that banks or countries can require that all bank accounts, financial institutions operating in their country, collect beneficial ownership information on all accounts in their institution. So this means that basically if we're going to open a bank account for you at our bank in this country, we need to know who you are, not the name of some offshore British Virgin Islands trust, but the actual human person that owns this account. That way we know if you're laundering this money. Beyond that, We also advocate some measures in the international community and in fora like the G20 and places like that to institute automatic exchange of tax information between all countries. And this is starting to catch on at the OECD and in the G20, where countries like the U.S. are actually starting to implement automatic exchange of tax information agreements, bilateral, for starters, between countries to crack down on tax evasion. This would go a long way in doing that, particularly with regards to individual tax evasion.
And it's interesting, as you've mentioned about the whole issue of tax evasion, is the fact that law-abiding citizens should certainly not oppose this whole process of transparency and accountability when we keep in mind the fact that most of these criminal enterprises are involved in either illicit trade of drugs or human trafficking or even terrorist networks. To use these particular opaque jurisdictions or those that are not providing information, and certainly these things are a threat to certainly our security aspects as well.
Absolutely. There's, every day there's another news article that I'm reading about a drug trafficker or terrorist or arms smuggler who's been opening anonymous shell companies in places like the U.S. and other developed countries even, and other offshore tax havens as well to launder their money and carry out their nefarious deeds. So yeah, and people that are doing the right thing, they have nothing to worry about from transparency measures like this. So
in implementing the U.S. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, the U.S. Department of Justice has gone after a number of companies in bribing foreign government officials. Mm-hmm. And those companies end up paying high penalties in settlements. However, the names of the foreign government officials in developing countries do not get exposed, and illicit enrichment does not get retrieved. Do you have some recommendations for those particular cases?
Generally, it's been a great tool to go after foreign bribery by multinational corporations, and it's important, I think, for people in the United States to know that the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, we think that bans foreign bribery by U.S. companies, but in reality, it's banning foreign bribery by any company that has any tie to the United States whatsoever.
Exactly,
so.
Yeah.
Most of these companies they've gone after, in fact, 8 out of the 10 top Foreign Corrupt Practices Act investment settlements have been with foreign companies. Siemens was one of the big ones.
Deutsche Telekom.
Exactly, yeah. So, a lot of foreign companies. This is not going out of our way to hinder U.S. companies. And in fact, corruption and a lot of these practices are a cost to doing business, and weeding out corruption levels the playing field and enables free enterprise, makes it easier for companies to go into developing countries and do business fairly.
It was interesting to note, Clark, that the government of Albania, when asked about these figures, protested, and it was quoted in one of the articles in Southeast Europe that members of the Albanian government were disputing the Global Financial Integrity Report, and then the opposition basically came out to label the existing government as corrupt. It really created a national debate within Albania and a number of countries in Southeast Europe. And what are your thoughts about some of these concerns, and what would your message be to the citizens of Southeast Europe when they see these huge amounts, whether it be Southeast Europe or developing countries in Asia or Africa? What would your message be to the citizens that certainly do want reforms in their countries?
What we're just doing is simply highlighting the numbers, and that there is a significant amount of money that has illicitly flown out of Albania, Montenegro, Croatia, a number of the sort of Southeast European nations you were mentioning, and that's just a fact. And there are a number of policy measures that can be implemented to curtail this outflow of money. Again, on the international stage at fora like the G20, but also domestically through policy measures that we mentioned before, like reforming the Customs Department and requiring that beneficial ownership information be collected on bank accounts. Right. There's stuff that can be done domestically. And
certainly. And it is important to note for our listeners that GFI Director Raymond Baker made the statement that developing economies are hemorrhaging more and more money at a time when rich and poor nations alike are struggling to spur economic growth. This report should be a wake-up call to world leaders that more must be done to address these harmful outflows, unquote. And as we look at 2013 and some of the initiatives that are already in place and certainly being moved forward. What should we expect this year as from a trend perspective, as what you've observed over the past few years in doing the study that has brought such light to some of these key issues that we're looking at today?
As Dr. Carr mentioned, we've only been really doing this sort of work for about 5 or 6 years now, and every year the awareness continues to build and more actions and awareness is taking place at the international stage. Just recently, this past month, David Cameron, Prime Minister of England, who's chairing the G8 this year, announced that he wants to use the G8 summit in 2013 to focus really on tax evasion. So, a lot is happening. The OECD is undergoing a study to look at automatic exchange of tax information between all countries and how that would come about, how that would happen. So one of the things I think that I would worry about, though, is while the tax evasion has started to sort of take off as an issue, worrying about the anonymous shell company issue and beneficial ownership issues falling on the back end. That's a major piece of this puzzle, and it enables a lot of the tax evasions, but it isn't talked about as much. And cracking down on anonymous shell companies is a key piece of this puzzle, and it can't fall by the wayside.
Mm-hmm. And in fact, if more countries would look at more of a transparent tax code, in the sense that they would remove all the loopholes and be able to keep it as simple and with an anti-corruption mechanism, that certainly would make a big difference and allow for a greater transparency in tracking down some of these illicit outflows as well. Absolutely.
And again, this has policy significance for developed countries too, like the U.S. as well. Senator Levin, who chairs the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations in the U.S. Senate, estimates that the U.S. government loses $150 billion a year in offshore tax haven abuses. So, I mean, that's $150 billion a year, $1.5 trillion over 10 years. That's a lot of money.
Indeed, it certainly is when you put all of this together. And I think we were all astounded when we looked at the fact that in these developing countries from 2001 to 2010, or 2010, developing countries lost $5.86 trillion to illicit outflows. And so this is certainly not some very small or insignificant number. It is a very significant number, and we truly commend you and your colleagues at Global Financial Integrity for releasing this important study, which helps all of us as citizens and those that are interested in how to be able to advance some of these key reform issues so that taxpayers and citizens alike can benefit from growth of their countries rather than having illicit outflows hemorrhage countries' vitality. Great. Thank you so much, Clark, for joining us on America's Roundtable.
Thank you, Clark.
All right. Thanks, Natasha and Joel.
This is America's Roundtable. Visit us at americasrt.com. Follow us on Twitter at americasrt. You can find us on YouTube and Facebook. Like and share.